Greetings everyone, Caleb here with the Left in the South project. Today we'll be discussing former wrestling superstar and my current mayor, Glenn Jacobs, better known by his stage name, Kane. Glenn Thomas Jacobs was born on April 26, 1967. He grew up near St. Louis and was heavily involved in athletics during high school and continuing into college, where he graduated with a degree in English Lit from Truman University. However, the Kane we're all familiar with really began to explode into the national spotlight after his entrance into wrestling starting in 1992. Initially, he wrestled in smaller venues under various stage names, including things like Angus King, Mike Unabomber, and a few others. But it wasn't until 1997 that the WWF debuted his new character, Kane. And standing at a hulking 7 foot tall, over 300 pounds, Kane enjoyed a meteoric rise to the top of the WWF, becoming one of the most infamous villains in the franchise's history. Along with his in-universe brother, Undertaker, they competed in many championship title matches, cementing the legacy of Kane in the annals of wrestling history. It was during this time he spent as a wrestler that he was first introduced to politics.
I'd always been interested in politics, but I never felt like I aligned with either side of the political spectrum, either the left or the right, because I agreed with the left on some things, but disagreed with them on other things, and vice versa with the right. Eventually, a friend of mine, actually a fellow wrestler, mentioned the term libertarian. He said, "You sound like a libertarian." And I always joke, I was like, "Man, you don't need to be calling me names, okay? We don't want to get into a fight here, right?" Because I had no idea what the term libertarian meant. So I did some research, and I found the Libertarian Party, and that's actually was my first exposure to libertarianism.
So clearly Glenn really resonates with libertarianism and considers himself to be one. By his own admission, the Libertarian Party was his political portal that went on to shape much of his politics during the early 2000s especially, which is why, for example, in 2008, he campaigned for and endorsed self-identified libertarian Ron Paul in his run for the presidency. But that's kind of a red flag for a lot of people who are familiar with Ron Paul's politics. What exactly does being a libertarian mean to Mayor Kane?
I'm what I would call an ad hoc libertarian. I mean, I would look at the issues and say, yeah, I think the libertarians are right about this. I think they're right about that. But once you get to that philosophical grounding of it's all based on our interpersonal relationships. And as people, we don't have the right to impose our will upon other people through violence. Well, neither does the state, neither does the government.
In many ways, Mayor Kane actually is a perfect example of a libertarian in the United States. Namely, many of his views don't really align with the ideology of libertarianism as it was originally conceived. When it was originally conceived as an idea, libertarianism and anarchism were interchangeable terms. The ideologies are primarily concerned with the dismantling of what they consider to be unjust hierarchies, and it's generally associated with leftist politics. However, when political figures in America today use the term libertarian, they're often not using the same definition as we are. It becomes obvious later in the same interview where Kane opens up about some of his political influences.
As I delved deep down the rabbit hole, I got to the more and more radical works, and then I got to Murray Rothbard. And there's the old saying that you just can't argue with him because all of his arguments are bulletproof. I mean, every objection that you bring up, Rothbard pretty much destroys. And for me, that was it. I was like, yeah, this guy knows what he's talking about.
Okay, so first of all, no. His ideas are not bulletproof in the slightest. In fact, among Marxist and materialist economists like myself, he's pretty much considered a charlatan. You see, Murray Rothbard is credited as the father of anarcho-capitalism, the founding of which is generally seen as a dick move among leftist economists.
But Professor Caleb, didn't you say anarchist? I thought you said anarchists were leftists. Doesn't that mean Rothbard is actually an ally?
Clearly you haven't been paying attention in my class. Please sit down. Okay, let me explain. Anarchism is a leftist ideology. In many ways, it is not unlike communism. To simplify it to a ridiculous degree, Communists and anarchists mostly agree on everything, such as a classless, stateless society, etc. The thing they disagree on mainly is the process by which society reaches this state. Anarcho-capitalists, on the other hand, are on the entire opposite of the spectrum, so to speak. To put it simply, they believe that the primary thing hindering society is the state and its ability to interfere with the market. During his life, Rothbard unironically argued that the Civil Rights Act needed to be abolished because he felt that it infringed on the property rights of Americans. Yikes. Ancoms don't care about hierarchy as long as that hierarchy is determined by wealth. And I hate to say that a lot of Rothbard's toxic ideas really show through in Kane's politics. For example, he wrote in an article on his blog in 2009 titled "The Feminists Are All Wet," wherein he heavily criticized the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, which Obama had signed in January of that same year. The legislation attempted to address the issue of the gendered pay gap that women face in our society today, and by any progressive standards, it was very minor in its effect. But that did not stop Kane from going on for nearly 1,000 words about how much of an infringement this bill was on the freedom of hardworking Americans. He says in it, quote, "In a free society, individuals enter into contracts of their own accord, with the assumption that the contract will benefit them. Government interference in private contracts prevent this process from taking place, hindering the individual's ability to improve his standard of living and usurping control over his life." End quote. Be vigilant, though, listener. Those with a sharp mind might notice that in this article, it is not the oppression that women are faced with Glenn is referring to. Not in the slightest. In fact, he's referring to the oppression business owners will now have to face because they can no longer discriminate their workers based on sex. It is a very important distinction and really is the main difference between, a true libertarian and someone like Glenn Jacobs. He goes on in the same article, quote, "The Ledbetter Act is aimed at equality, but individuals are not equal. We all have different talents, resources, interests, abilities, educations, and backgrounds. In a free market, individual persons can find the niche in which they can exploit their talents to mold their lives in the way that they wish. In addition, employers are less willing to hire employees who they believe could subject them to increased liability. Thus, instead of equalizing pay between men and women, the Ledbetter Act will lead to higher unemployment rates among women." End quote. I mean, really think about what he's saying here. He's making the argument that if we force business owners to pay men and women the same wage for the same work, it will somehow lead to higher unemployment among women. I'm not sure how that works, but it would work if you believe that, well, the reason we don't pay women as much is because they aren't worth as much. And that's exactly the argument that he's making in this article. It's through Rothbard that Mayor Kane says he was first introduced to the Austrian school of economic thought, to which he was immediately drawn. If you aren't familiar with the school of thought, it can be closely compared to classical economics, the likes of Adam Smith. However, this school of thought kind of comes packaged with a few really convenient moral justifications for the exploitation present under a free market economy with little to no regulation. Members of the Austrian school often make arguments you've probably heard before, like, if only this market were freer, it would perform better, and in general, they think most any form of regulation is probably bad. But in my opinion, slapping a cool moral justification on your ideology doesn't suddenly make it moral. And I would argue that the political heroes Glenn claims influenced him are actually political villains. His comments about women are particularly enraging, and if Mayor Kane sees this by some stroke of luck, I hope he can clarify what he really meant in that article. Let's move on.
I never took a course in economics in college because I'm not really interested in math. So I had absolutely no interest in economics until I discovered Austrian economics. I was like, oh, okay.
So some less charitable people would probably make fun of this statement, but actually I don't find a problem with it. I mean, I'm an economist, for God's sake. We're weird nerds, and yeah, it's really boring. But if that's the case, can't we just leave the economics to the economists? which is why this next clip really just baffles my mind, honestly. Kane has this really weird obsession with the Federal Reserve. He's literally written several blog posts and articles about why he hates the Fed, and it's practically the root of like all modern evils in society. He even made this really cute video about it.
So most people would consider money one of the most important things in their lives. But how many people actually understand what money is and how it works? In 1910, some of the world's most powerful men met in secret in Hoboken, New Jersey. This was a real-life conspiracy. And these gentlemen came together and they fundamentally altered the banking and monetary system of America. And in my opinion, they actually fundamentally altered the character of America. Did you know that the money in your wallet, we say that the dollar is as good as gold? Did you know it's not actually backed by gold? In fact, it's not backed by anything at all. It's actually backed by debt. And if the government were to pay off all of its debt, there would be no money. Did you know that when the Federal Reserve stimulates the economy by giving the government a bunch of money they can spend, that it actually hurts you? All that stuff is due to what happened here in this place in 1910 when the plans for the Federal Reserve System were formulated. Learn about Jekyll Island, Georgia, learn about what happened here, and learn about the Federal Reserve System, because I think that's one of the most important issues that we face in America today.
The way he talks about Jekyll Island is just kind of funny to me. Like, it was a global conspiracy. The most powerful men met and created this secret, thing to subvert American democracy. It's just it's almost funny to me how elementary this take is, to be honest. It's like, honestly, baby Kane's first economics class. Did you know your money isn't actually worth anything? Like, come on, man. I guess in some ways he's not entirely wrong in saying that fiat money isn't backed by anything, so to speak. But in reality, that's not really the full truth. The government only accepts taxes in the form of U.S. currency, so there actually is a direct relationship between the money supply and labor in the form of taxation, which is in some ways what he's referring to when he's talking about debt, but again, I think it's an important distinction. And because of the government's monopoly on violence, you really have no choice but to participate in the economy through the use of fiat currency, which ironically actually does make it a very stable currency. Not to mention that commodity money, the alternative to fiat money that Kane seems to believe in, is hotly debated in the world of economics. There are positives and negatives to both forms of monetary value, but it's generally agreed among mainstream economists that fiat currency allows for a more stable economy than those with a currency backed by commodities such as gold. The main belief was not always that, but these days I hear most economists making that argument. But again, I'm oversimplifying it, and there are plenty of very interesting readings you can examine on the topic, and some people like myself don't necessarily believe in money at all. So I wouldn't just take this as, a piece of education. Look into it on your own. It's really interesting. But Jacobs actually has a history of posting really small brain takes about economics on his blog. His hatred of Marxism quite literally drips off the page in some of his articles. Here's a cool quote. Isn't it ironic that even after history has proven his theories wrong, dangerous, and potentially suicidal, Karl Marx still influences so much of contemporary economic thought? End quote. God, it would take me an hour to get into all of the preconceptions that I disagree with in this question, but just the last part is what I'll talk about. Influences so much of contemporary economic thought. Has he looked around? He's mayor, for God's sake. I've literally never seen a Marxist in a position of power in this country, really almost ever, not in a serious position of power, that is. And I don't know. But anyway, here's another hot take. If the decision to sell our labor is voluntary and consensual, and if there's no fraud involved, how can this agreement be called exploitation? Wow. Sounds like something Ben Just Sell Your House Shapiro would say, and that definitely is not a compliment. Ultimately, Mayor, with all due respect, I think it's best to just leave the economics to the economists. You can be a good leader and defer to those who have spent their entire lifetime studying these topics. In fact, I really don't think you can have one without the other. However, I call into question Mayor Jacobs' conviction to be a good leader at all. because recently he has shown he's willing to sacrifice lives for political points. In May of this year, he fought hard to keep school graduation ceremonies in person, even while faced with the harsh reality of the COVID-19 pandemic. Here he can be seen attending ceremonies where the bleachers are packed with onlookers, none of which appear to be wearing masks. Additionally, in a recent vote, the mayor was the only member of the Knox County Board of Health to vote against a mask mandate for most people inside public buildings. The board consisted of 6 medical professionals and 1 representative from the Knox County school system, all of which agreed unanimously to vote yes to the mandate. Mayor Jacobs, faced with the information that his vote could potentially cost the lives of some of his constituents, chose to vote against the majority to score cheap political points. I'm making this video because I think it's important for us to hold our mayor accountable for his actions and words, and I believe it is truly dangerous if we let this go unchecked for too long. I couldn't say it better than Mayor Jacobs himself. Here he is after his mayoral victory in 2018, addressing a room of his Republican supporters.
As Republicans, we have to work even harder to ensure that the Democrats never get control of Tennessee or the federal seats in Tennessee. The Republican Party must remain a bulwark against European democratic socialism, which unfortunately the Democratic Party has become. That's how we need to grow this party, is by ensuring that those are the ideas that we are spreading. Someone like me, I think, is uniquely positioned to help in that respect. One of my goals as Knox County Mayor is to work with the state Republican Party and to grow our party across the state of Tennessee, especially among people who traditionally were not considered Republicans. And if we do that, that big red wall will stand firm forever. Thank you all so much. And now let's have a good time.
If we don't address this now, this dangerous ideology will grow. And to Mayor Kane, I ask, what do you have to say about your positions, particularly the one concerning women, which I feel like was the most damning? Do you feel differently about those topics now? Have you changed your mind? I would love some clarification on the topic. And I think the people of Knox County deserve an answer sooner rather than later. Thanks for watching.